A soldier's dog ran away. Years later, it led police to a chilling discovery. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink as Ethan Walker stepped out onto his front porch. He whistled, the sharp sound cutting through the tranquil evening air. "Shadow. Here, boy." Ethan waited, but the familiar jingle of dog tags and eager bark of his loyal German shepherd didn't come. Frowning, he stepped off the porch and into the front yard, scanning the surroundings. "Shadow?" Still no sign of the dog. A prickle of unease ran down Ethan's spine. It wasn't like Shadow to wander off or not come when called. As a highly trained military working dog, he was disciplined and always stayed close to Ethan's side, just as he had during their tours of duty overseas. Ethan crossed the yard, his boots crunching on the gravel driveway. He checked Shadow's usual haunts, the garden shed where he liked to nap in the shade, the stretch along the back fence he patrolled like he was still on guard duty. But there was no trace of the big shepherd anywhere. "Shadow." Ethan called again, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "Come." Only the chirping of crickets answered him. With growing trepidation, Ethan circled the entire property, searching every corner of the spacious yard that bordered the woods at the edge of town. But deep down, he already knew the terrible truth. Shadow was gone. The next morning, Ethan began his search in earnest. He papered the town with lost dog flyers, offering a generous reward for Shadow's safe return. He knocked on neighbors' doors, stopped people out walking their own dogs to ask if they'd seen the missing shepherd. He even drove out to the surrounding communities, checking with animal shelters and vet clinics. But everywhere he went, the answer was the same: no one had seen hide nor hair of Shadow. It was as if the loyal, larger-than-life dog had simply vanished off the face of the earth. As the days stretched into weeks with no sign of Shadow, Ethan grew more desperate. He knew it was unlikely the highly trained dog had just run away. Shadow had been his constant companion since he left the army, helping him adjust to civilian life, warding off the nightmares and darker thoughts that sometimes crept in. Losing him was like losing a part of himself. Ethan's dread began to mingle with anger. He couldn't shake the sinking suspicion that someone had taken Shadow. He knew there were unscrupulous people out there who would steal a purebred dog either for resale or for more sinister purposes, like dog fighting rings. The thought of Shadow falling into such cruel hands made his blood boil. But he had no proof, no trail to follow. And so he was left to wait and to worry, his once cozy home now achingly empty without Shadow by his side. The only spark of hope he clung to was the dog tag still hanging by the front door, the one Shadow had worn throughout their military service together. Ethan wrapped his hand around them each night like a talisman. "I'll find you, boy," he whispered. "I promise. Wherever you are, I won't give up until I bring you home." Unbeknownst to Ethan, forces beyond his control had been circling his peaceful corner of the world for years, like sharks scenting blood in the water. While he'd been overseas serving his country, his once quaint hometown had fallen under the influence of one man, Victor Langley. On the surface, Langley was a successful businessman and property developer, well respected in the community. But behind closed doors, he had his fingers in every pie, from narcotics to illegal gambling to extortion. He fancied himself an old-school mob boss, ruling the town's underbelly with an iron fist. Like any competent crime lord, Langley was always looking to expand his enterprises and eliminate potential threats. He had crooked cops and politicians in his pocket to smooth the way. But lately, there had been rumors of a federal task force looking into his dealings. He needed to clean the house, remove any liabilities. That's where Shadow came in. The dog had been on Langley's radar since Ethan moved back to town. Langley made it his business to know everything about potential adversaries, and he didn't like the idea of a decorated veteran with an expertly trained guard dog living on his turf. When the opportunity presented itself, Langley hadn't hesitated. He dispatched a couple of his goons to snatch the dog, figuring its disappearance would keep Ethan distracted and demoralized. They grabbed Shadow one night when Ethan let him out into the yard for a quick bathroom break before bed. The shepherd put up a ferocious fight, but he was outnumbered. A few tranquilizer darts took the wind out of his sails long enough for the men to throw him in the back of a van and spirit him away to a remote location. Langley had planned to dispose of the dog once Ethan gave up the search. 1.45 to the head and an unmarked grave in the woods would tie up that loose end. But for now, he'd keep the shepherd caged and alive, an insurance policy in case he needed further leverage over the former soldier. Smirking to himself in the opulent surroundings of his study, Langley poured 2 fingers of expensive scotch and silently toasted his own cleverness. The town and everyone in it belonged to him, and he aimed to keep it that way at any cost. 3 years later, Detective Ryan Briggs pinched the bridge of his nose as he looked down at the case files strewn across his desk. 3 years he'd been working to bring down Victor Langley's criminal empire. 3 years of late nights and dead ends, always feeling like the evidence he needed was just out of grasp. It hadn't helped that his own department was riddled with corruption, officers loyal to Langley undermining the investigation at every turn. The only bright spot had been the day he met Sophia Kane, the fiery young reporter who had been doggedly covering Langley's misdeeds. She'd marched into the station one day, demanding to speak to the detective in charge of the Langley case. Briggs had been reluctant to trust a journalist, but Sophia quickly proved herself a valuable ally. She had sources and information even he couldn't access. Together, they had slowly begun to chip away at Langley's facade. But it was an uphill battle. For every small victory, there was another setback. Missing witnesses. Evidence disappearing from the lockup. They were always one step behind. Briggs sighed heavily and got up to refill his coffee mug. As he did, his phone began to buzz insistently. He glanced at the screen and saw it was dispatched. Groaning internally, he answered. "Briggs. Detective, we've got a possible 187 out near Glenwood Ridge," the dispatcher informed him crisply. "Some hikers came across what looks to be a human skull in the woods." Briggs frowned. A bone case was the last thing he needed right now. But Glenwood Ridge was a remote area on the outskirts of Langley's property holdings. That piqued his interest. "I'll head out there," he said. "Have Eunice lock down the scene. And see if you can get a hold of the coroner to meet me." He hung up and began to gather his things. He had no idea this grisly discovery was about to blow the Langley case wide open, or that he was about to cross paths with a very unexpected source. Shadow was coming home at last, to finish what he'd started all those years ago. And this time, there would be no stopping him until the truth was revealed and justice was served. The late afternoon sun slanted through the towering evergreens as Ethan parked his truck at the Glenwood Ridge trailhead and hopped out. The police scanner he kept at home had crackled to life an hour ago with reports of possible human remains found in the area. His heart had seized at the location. It was one of the places he'd searched most vigorously when Shadow first disappeared. He knew he shouldn't get his hopes up. The likelihood that this grim discovery had anything to do with his missing dog was slim. But he couldn't just sit at home, not when there was even the tiniest chance of a lead. As he approached the taped-off crime scene, he spotted a tall man in a suit conferring with uniformed officers. The man looked up as Ethan ducked under the police tape, his eyes narrowing. "Excuse me, this is an active investigation. I'm going to need you to step back." Ethan held up his hands placatingly. "Detective Briggs? I'm Ethan Walker. I think you knew my father, Bill Walker. He was a cop in town for 30 years. Briggs's expression softened slightly as recognition dawned. "Bill's boy? He was a damn good policeman. But I still can't let you contaminate my crime scene. Why don't you tell me what brought you out here?" Ethan sighed, running a hand through his close-cropped hair. "This is going to sound crazy, but my dog. He went missing 3 years ago, and this is one of the last places I searched before the trail went cold." Briggs's brow furrowed. "No offense, but we're dealing with human remains here. I'm not sure what that has to do with your dog." "I know it's a long shot," Ethan said. "But Shadow isn't just a pet. He's a highly trained military working dog. He wouldn't have run off on his own. I've always suspected someone took him." I guess I'm just hoping, maybe he witnessed something. Maybe that's why he disappeared. The detective looked at him for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. Look, I can't make any promises. But if we find anything that might be related to your dog, I'll let you know. For now, the best thing you can do is head home and let us work. Ethan wanted to argue, but he could see the sense in Briggs's words. He didn't want to impede the investigation. Reluctantly, he nodded. I appreciate it, Detective. I'll get out of your hair. But please, keep me posted. As he turned to leave, a flash of movement in the underbrush caught his eye. He squinted, trying to make out the shape, and then his heart stopped. A very familiar black and tan shepherd was staring back at him from the tree line. Shadow, he breathed. At the sound of his voice, the dog bounded towards him, moving stiffly but determinedly. Ethan dropped to his knees as Shadow crashed into him, licking his face frantically as if trying to make up for the lost years. Ethan buried his face in the thick fur of Shadow's neck, tears pricking his eyes. His dog had come home. And from the way Shadow kept glancing back at the crime scene, Ethan knew he hadn't done so by chance. The game was afoot now. And Langley's days of secrecy were numbered. Sophia Kane worried at her lower lip as she skimmed the internal police reports Briggs had slipped her. The documents confirmed what they'd long suspected: the bones found in the woods belonged to a low-level crook named Lenny Moscone, a known Langley associate who had been rumored to turn state's witness before disappearing 2 years prior. This was the break they'd been waiting for, the thread that could unravel Langley's carefully crafted web of crime and corruption. But Sophia knew they had to tread carefully. Start pulling too hard, and Langley would feel them closing in. There was no telling how he might retaliate. The other wildcard in the equation was Ethan Walker. Sophia felt for the man, she truly did. To lose a beloved dog was terrible enough, but to spend years wondering, not knowing the animal's fate, it didn't bear thinking about. And now, as if by some miracle, the dog had returned on the very day a body connected to their investigation was discovered. Sophia didn't believe in coincidences. She'd been a journalist long enough to know that the universe was rarely so lazy. No, Shadow's reappearance meant something. Sophia just wasn't sure what, yet. But she aimed to find out. Decision made, she reached for her phone and dialed Ethan's number. She'd gotten it from Briggs, who seemed to share her conviction that the former soldier could be an asset rather than a hindrance in their hunt for the truth. Ethan picked up on the second ring, his voice rough with exhaustion and barely restrained emotion. Hello? Mr. Walker, this is Sophia Kane from the Daily Herald. I was hoping we could meet. I have some information about your dog and what he might have witnessed. There was a weighted pause, and then Ethan spoke, his tone hardening with resolve. Tell me where and when. I'll be there. Sophia smiled grimly as the line went dead. The game is on now. And one way or another, she knew Shadow was the key to unlocking the truth that had stayed buried in Glenwood Ridge for far too long. Ethan sat across from Sophia in a booth at the back of Joe's Diner, a no-nonsense greasy spoon on the outskirts of town. The vinyl seats were cracked and the Formica tabletop was scratched, but the coffee was hot and strong and no one paid them any mind. Shadow lay curled at Ethan's feet under the table, his warm weight a steadying presence. The shepherd had barely left his side since their reunion, and Ethan was loath to let him out of his sight again. Every so often, Shadow's ears would twitch towards the door, his dark eyes scanning the room as if searching for hidden dangers. So, Ethan said after their waitress had departed with their orders. You said you had information about Shadow. About what happened to him. Sophia leaned forward, lowering her voice. What do you know about Victor Langley? Ethan's brow furrowed. The real estate guy? Not much. I know he's been buying up a lot of property around town, but I've been kind of out of the loop since I got back from my last deployment. He's more than just a real estate developer, Sophia said grimly. He's the top crime boss in this county, and probably the state. Drugs, racketeering, money laundering, murder for hire, you name it, he's got a finger in it. Ethan blinked, taken aback. Okay, but what does that have to do with Shadow? Sophia glanced around to make sure no one was within earshot, then continued. We think Shadow may have witnessed Langley's men disposing of a body. A man named Lenny Moscone, small-time drug dealer, but he worked for Langley. Word is he was thinking of flipping on Langley to save his own skin. Ethan's eyes widened as realization dawned. The remains they found in Glenwood Ridge, that was Moscone? Sophia nodded. Bullets to the back of the head, classic organized crime execution. Langley most likely thought he'd buried his secrets with the body. But he didn't count on Shadow. She withdrew a manila folder from her bag and slid it across the table to Ethan. My partner in the investigations unit, Detective Briggs, pulled the original missing dog reports. The first sightings of Shadow after he disappeared 3 years ago were in the Glenwood Ridge area, right around the time we think Moscone was killed. Ethan opened the file with shaking hands, scanning the reports and grainy security cam photos. There was Shadow, looking thin and bedraggled but unmistakable, slinking around the edges of the forest. We think Shadow may have been at the scene when Moscone was killed, Sophia said quietly. And that Langley's men grabbed him to keep him from leading anyone to the body. A trained military dog showing up in the wrong place at the wrong time would have been a liability they couldn't afford. Ethan looked up at her, his expression hardening. So Langley had my dog this whole time, he asked, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. We don't know for sure, Sophia said. But it would make sense for Langley to keep him contained, at least until he was sure you'd given up searching. Under the table, Shadow lifted his head and licked Ethan's hand, as if sensing his distress. Ethan scratched the dog's ears, trying to rein in his emotions. So what happens now? Now, said Sophia, we use what Shadow knows to bring Langley down. And we make damn sure he never gets the chance to hurt anyone, or any animal, ever again. Over the next few weeks, Ethan, Sophia, and Detective Briggs worked tirelessly to piece together the evidence Shadow's reappearance had shaken loose. It was slow goings. Langley had spent years covering his tracks, and his network of crooked cops and paid-off officials ran deep. But for the first time, they felt like they were making a real headway. Informants who had been too scared to come forward before were suddenly willing to talk, bolstered by the knowledge that Langley's iron grip on the town was slipping. Shadow proved invaluable to the investigation. Under Ethan's guidance, the shepherd led them to several locations deep in the woods of Glenwood Ridge that held evidence of Langley's misdeeds, shell casings, scraps of bloody clothing, even another shallow grave. Each new discovery compounded the case against Langley. But Ethan knew they needed more than circumstantial evidence to bring the kingpin down for good. They needed something that would tie Langley directly to his crimes, something irrefutable. He pored over his old contacts from his military days, calling in every favor he could think of. And finally, he struck pay dirt. A surveillance expert he'd served with agreed to come to town and sweep Langley's properties for any hidden cameras or recording devices that could have captured his illegal activities. It was a long shot, but it paid off in spades. The expert found a series of concealed cameras in Langley's main office, ones even his own team didn't seem to know about. And when they reviewed the footage, they found a damning recording of Langley himself coldly ordering the execution of Lenny Moscone. We've got him, Briggs said, his voice trembling slightly as they watched the murder play out on the screen. This is it. The silver bullet. Sophia gripped Ethan's hand tightly, her eyes shining with unshed tears of victory and relief. Next to them, Shadow's tail wagged slowly as if he could sense the change in the air, the impending completion of the mission he had unknowingly embarked upon 3 years ago. They moved swiftly after that, knowing that every second counted. Judge Walters, the one honest man left on the bench, signed off on the arrest warrants with grim satisfaction. And as dawn broke over the sleeping town, a joint task force of state police and federal agents swarmed Langley's compound. Ethan and Shadow were there, watching from a rise overlooking the scene as Langley was led out in handcuffs, spitting obscenities. The crime lord seemed to shrink as he was shoved into the back of a squad car, his power and menace diminished in the cold light of justice. As the convoy of police vehicles rolled away, Ethan looked down at Shadow. The big shepherd gazed back at him, his eyes clear and bright, his mission finally complete. "Good boy," Ethan whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You did it, Shadow. You brought the truth to light. And now our family, our pack, we can be whole again." The months that followed Langley's arrest were a time of healing and reformation for the town. With the kingpin's oppressive influence gone, people seemed to stand a little straighter, breathe a little easier. His criminal empire quickly crumbled without him at the helm, his former associates falling over themselves to cut deals and turn state's evidence in the hopes of lighter sentences. Sophia's stories on the Langley takedown and the extent of his corruption won national attention and journalism awards. But for her, the real reward was seeing her hometown start to reclaim its soul, shaking off the taint of fear and violence that had weighed it down for so long. Briggs was promoted to captain and tasked with rebuilding the police department from the ground up. It was a daunting task, but one he tackled with grim determination. He rooted out the crooked cops on Langley's payroll and brought in honest, hard-working officers who shared his commitment to the community. Slowly but surely, a new sense of trust and cooperation grew between the police and the citizens they served. The shadow of corruption that had darkened their town for so long finally began to lift. For Ethan, there was a personal sense of peace and closure. With Shadow safely home, he could finally lay down the burden of guilt and grief he'd carried since the day the dog first disappeared. He returned to his long-neglected woodworking, channeling his energies into crafting beautiful furniture that he sold at the local farmers' market on weekends. People began to seek him out, drawn to the quiet strength and compassion that seemed to emanate from him like a beacon. And always, Shadow was by his side, a little grayer around the muzzle now, his joints stiff with encroaching age, but with the same bright spirit and unwavering loyalty he'd always shown. The two of them became a fixture around town, living symbols of the resilience and hope that had seen their community through its darkest hour. As the months turned to years, the scars Langley left began to fade. Green spaces and community gardens sprung up where his illicit businesses had once stood. Neighbors looked out for one another, kindness and trust replacing suspicion and fear. And at the center of it all, a man and his dog, two old warriors who had been to hell and back together, who had stared down evil and refused to blink, finding peace, at long last, in the simple joys of each other's companionship and service to the town they called home. But even as the town healed and moved forward, the specter of Victor Langley still loomed. His trial was a long and arduous process, delayed by his high-priced lawyers' legal maneuverings. For Ethan, each day Langley sat in a cell awaiting justice was both a victory and a torment. He longed for a public reckoning, an announcement of guilt and a final accounting of the crime lord's sins. But a part of him also dreaded dredging up the painful memories again, reliving those dark years of Shadow's absence. The day Ethan was called to testify, he rose before the sun, his heart heavy in his chest as he went through the motions of his morning routine. As he reached for Shadow's leash by the door, he hesitated. Shadow looked up at him, his dark eyes soft with understanding. And in that moment, Ethan knew he couldn't face this alone. He needed his partner, his loyal friend, by his side. When they entered the courthouse together, Shadow's presence drew stares and murmurs from the gallery. But Ethan held his head high, drawing strength from the warm weight of the dog pressed against his leg. On the stand, Ethan spoke with calm conviction about the day Shadow disappeared and the toll those lost years had taken. He described how the shepherd's reappearance had blown the case wide open, leading them to the evidence that brought Langley to justice. Through it all, Shadow lay quietly at his feet, a steadying anchor in the storm of memories. And when Ethan's voice faltered, when the tears threatened to choke off his words, he looked down to find Shadow gazing back at him, proud, unwavering, a silent promise of "I'm here. We can do this." In the end, the jury took less than a day to return with their verdict, guilty on all counts. As the foreman read the decision, Langley seemed to crumple in on himself, all his arrogance and bravado drained away. Ethan watched, feeling a profound sense of lightness wash over him, as if he'd been carrying a weight on his soul that was finally lifted. He reached down and laid a hand on Shadow's head, feeling the dog lean into his touch. They had weathered the tempest. They had fought the good fight and emerged battered but unbroken on the other side. And now they could rest. Now they could heal, assured that the man who had caused so much pain would never again see the light of day as a free man. That night, Ethan built a bonfire in his backyard. He sat with Shadow under the stars, watching the flames dance and the embers float into the night sky. And he made a silent promise to live each day forward in service of the ideals that he and Shadow had fought so hard to uphold: justice, loyalty, and love. Always love. The years rolled on, each one a little gentler, a little brighter than the last. Ethan found new purpose in his work with the local Veterans Center, using his experiences to help other soldiers readjust to civilian life. He understood better than most the challenges they faced, the invisible wounds they carried. And with Shadow by his side, he was able to reach even the most withdrawn, offering a listening ear and a compassionate heart. Sophia continued her crusade for truth as an investigative journalist, shining light into dark places and giving voice to the voiceless. She and Briggs, who took over as chief of police, became a formidable team, rooting out corruption and injustice wherever they found it. But they made time for joy, too. Their wedding day was a grand celebration, the whole town turning out to cheer as they exchanged vows in the city park. Shadow, now sporting a distinguished gray muzzle, served as ring bearer, carrying out his duty with all the seriousness and dedication he'd shown in his police work. As the years went by, Shadow began to slow. His steps became more measured, his naps longer and more frequent. But his spirit remained undimmed, his devotion to Ethan unwavering. Even as his body failed, he insisted on accompanying Ethan to the Veterans Center each day, his very presence a balm to troubled souls. The old dog would lay his head on shaking knees, shaggy tail thumping gently, until tears gave way to tentative smiles. Ethan knew their time was growing short. And so he set about making each day a gift: an extra spoonful of broth on Shadow's dinner, an extra long belly rub in the sun-dappled yard. Small gestures of love and gratitude for a lifetime of steadfast companionship. When the end came, it was peaceful. Shadow slipped away in his sleep, his head cradled in Ethan's lap. Ethan buried him on a hilltop overlooking town, a simple granite marker bearing the inscription, Shadow. Loyal friend. Brave protector. He brought the truth to light. As he laid a bunch of wildflowers on the fresh-turned earth, Ethan felt a profound sense of both grief and gratitude. Grief for the loss of his dearest friend. But gratitude, too, for the gift of Shadow's love, for the difference one dog's courage had made. He knew Shadow's legacy would endure, in the hearts of all those he had touched and in the very fabric of the town he had helped to heal. And as Ethan turned his face to the sun, he could almost feel the warmth of the old dog leaning against his leg, a comforting presence, now and always. The years continued their inexorable march, but the town Shadow left behind stayed true to his ideals. Each annual Memorial Day parade ended with a wreath laying at the old dog's gravesite, a reminder and a tribute to the courage that had saved them all. Ethan never took another dog. Shadow, he said, could never be replaced, and he was content with his memories and the knowledge of the good they had done. But he found solace in his growing family, his nieces and nephews who clamored for Uncle Ethan to regale them with tales of his adventures with Shadow. To them, Shadow was a legend, a superhero in furry form. They would sit in rapt attention as Ethan recounted the story of the brave dog who had brought a bad man to justice and healed a broken town. And in their bright eyes, Ethan saw reflected the spark of compassion and righteousness that Shadow had embodied. As the decades passed, the town continued to thrive. The seeds of hope and resilience Shadow had helped to plant took deep root, blossoming into a vibrant, tight-knit community. The old divisions and grievances faded, replaced by a shared commitment to the common good. Sophia's son took over the family newspaper, carrying on her legacy of truth-telling and holding power to account. Briggs's daughter became chief of police, inheriting her father's mantle of integrity and service. And through it all, the spirit of a brave dog named Shadow seemed to watch over them, an unseen guardian, a reminder of the power of one act of courage to change the world. Ethan lived to a ripe old age, his steps slow but his mind sharp and his heart full. And when his time came, he slipped away peacefully, a smile on his withered face. They buried him on the hilltop next to Shadow, two old warriors reunited at last. And as the town gathered to bid him farewell, they knew his legacy, like Shadow's, would endure. For it was there in each act of kindness, each stand against injustice. It was there in the laughter of children playing freely in the streets and the gentle thrum of a community at peace. They were there, the man and the dog, in the very heartbeat of the town they had saved. Watching over them all, now and forever, from their place among the stars. Decades turned to generations, and the legend of Shadow and Ethan only grew. Their story was passed down through family lore, woven into the very history of the town itself. The granite marker on the hilltop became a place of pilgrimage, a touchstone for those seeking courage in the face of adversity. Young police officers would come to lay a hand on the sun-warmed stone before they hit the streets, drawing strength from the memory of the dog who had been both a fierce guardian and a gentle friend. At the Veteran Center Ethan had poured his heart into, a new therapy dog program took root. The dogs, many of them rescuing themselves, seemed to carry a spark of Shadow's spirit, a deep empathy, and an uncanny ability to soothe troubled hearts. Ethan's great-grandson, a gentle giant of a man with his ancestors' quiet strength, took the helm of the program. And as he watched the partnership between vets and dogs blossom, he could almost feel the warm presence of Ethan and Shadow at his shoulder, a silent benediction. The town, too, became a model of what a community could be when it was rooted in compassion and a commitment to justice. It wasn't perfect, no place ever is, but it was a beacon, a shining example of the good that could grow from even the darkest of soils. On the centennial anniversary of Langley's downfall, they erected a statue in the town square. Not of Ethan, though many argued for it. Not even of Shadow, though that would have been fitting. No, the statue was of a police badge, rendered in bronze, a glowing testament to the courage Shadow had inspired in all of them. A shield and defender, worn with honor, to protect and serve. In the green space around it, wildflowers grew in abundance, the same kind that Ethan had laid on Shadow's grave so many years ago. And when the wind blew just right, you could almost hear the faint, joyful bark of a dog romping through the blooms. For while Ethan and Shadow were gone, while the generation that had known them slipped slowly away, their legacy endured. In the bonds of community, in the rejection of fear, in the unshakable knowledge that one good dog and one brave man could change the course of history. Their story, after all, was a reminder. A promise. That there is no darkness too deep for the light of courage and love to pierce. That together, we are always stronger than the shadows. And so the story of Shadow and Ethan passed into legend, a tale told to inspire and uplift, to remind us of the best of what we can be. Parents would tuck their children into bed with the story of the brave dog and his devoted human, the two hearts that beat as one in the face of evil. And in those young minds and souls, the seeds of compassion and courage took root, nurtured by the shining example of a bond that not even death could break. For wasn't that the miracle of it? That long after Ethan and Shadow had left this mortal coil, long after their bones had turned to dust and memory, their love endured. It was there in every kind word, every helping hand, every stand against injustice. It was there in the way the town faced each new challenge with unity and resolve, secure in the knowledge that they could weather any storm as long as they stood together. It was there in the laughter of children, the dignity of elders, the quiet pride of a community that knew its worth. And on warm summer evenings, when the breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and the stars danced in the velvet sky, you could almost feel them there. Ethan and Shadow, side by side, watching over the town they loved. You could see them in the twinkle of an old man's eye as he spun their tale to a new generation, his voice rich with the cadence of remembrance. You could hear them in the contented sigh of a therapy dog, its muzzle resting on the knee of a veteran who had found hope again. They were there, always, woven into the very fabric of the world they had touched. A reminder that love is stronger than fear, that courage can move mountains, that the light of a good heart can never be extinguished. And so we carry them with us, Ethan and Shadow, in our own hearts and in the stories we tell. We carry them as a promise, a prayer, a north star to guide us through the darkest of nights. For as long as we remember them, as long as we strive to live by their example, they will never truly be gone. They will be there, always, in the love we share, the good we do, the world we build together. A world where every heart is brave, every soul is kind, and every corner is lit by the warm, eternal glow of the love between a man and his dog. A love that changed everything, forever and always.